Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the SMI for the invitation to speak today. And thank you to all the speakers as well speaking before me. I've been frantically scribbling down on my notes of points to add or points not to add, which I was going to discuss, which I was going to say make my notes illegible, but as my 9-year-old daughter told me yesterday, Daddy, your handwriting is crap. First of all, I got over the shock of her language and then the daunting realization that my handwriting isn't that great. But firstly, just an overview of the Maritime Decarbonisation Hub. This follows on from work Lloyd Register did really from 2016 to 2020 on a number of papers which we co-wrote with UMass. And that was the Low Carbon Pathways 2050, and the Zero Emission Vessel Transition Pathways, and a few other papers. And really these papers started to bring the debate of the energy transition and how this is moving forward. Now we hit a sort of a roadblock. We can't just keep going on doing papers and talking about it. We had to then deliver action. And this is separate from the regulatory part of Lloyd's Register and the advisory services. So fortunately, we received a grant from the Lloyd's Register Foundation for a program to basically accelerate. So our mission is to accelerate the safe and sustainable decarbonisation of the maritime industry. And we're working across 5 levers: safety, technology, policy, investment, and sustainability. And we're looking at all of those. And today I'll give a bit of an overview of how we're looking at them. So I'll give an overview today. I'll talk about the stakeholders and challenges, and then I'll talk about some ways forward. We can't just talk about the challenges all the time. So just to give context of where we are at the moment in the maritime industry, the current IMO targets are 50% by 2050, as shown here, in absolute terms compared to 2008 levels. Now, when this came out in 2016, very much the industry voice was, how is this possible? How are we going to reach 2050? But let's go back to COP26 in Glasgow in November last year. And very much the conversation started shifting. We had the Declaration on Zero Carbon Shipping by 2050. That was signed by 14 states, including the UK. So suddenly we're now moving from a 50% reduction by 2050 to a complete zero reduction in line with the Paris Agreement. We had the Clydebank Declaration, 22 signatories, including UK, signing up to support green corridors. So corridors running on zero-emission fuels between 2 ports. And that was signed by the UK as well. And then more importantly, so we've talked about the IMO and the regulatory push. We've seen push from the IMO, from the EU as well on the regulatory side. But more importantly, then we saw the First Movers Coalition. So that was Maersk, Trafigura, Amazon, with 5% deep sea zero emission shipping by 2030, with cargo operators as well for 10% by volume of ZEV vessels by 2030 and 100% by 2050. So we're seeing that commercial push, and then even more, we move forward, we've got the COZEV, so the cargo owners for zero emission vessels, which came in, and that was really looking to decarbonize by 2040. So whilst the ambition has moved from 50% by 2050 to zero, we're seeing some areas as well now moving that timeline forward to 2040, so forward by 10 years. And we can also put Operation Zero into that, which was discussed earlier. But I think, first of all, we also need to look at what are we talking about here? Why do we need to move to zero emission or to zero carbon fuels? And what are the challenges? Why is this not happening today? So let's rewind a bit to the last energy transition, where we moved from coal to oil. And why did we move from coal to oil? Well, we had an abundant fuel. It was an available fuel. It was easier to store than coal. It was cheaper, and in many ways it was safer as well. Now, when we're looking at some of the fuel demands or fuels we're talking about for the future time, ammonia, hydrogen, we're certainly not talking about them being safer. And even if we go for equivalence of safety, we're not going to tick that box. So we've got to look at ways to make that work. Reliability or the affordability, the fuels are going to cost 2 to 4 times as much. So how are we going to create the catalyst to get these fuels into action? Fuel efficient or even fuel density. The fuels are going to be less energy dense than the fuels today. The one box or the two boxes it is ticking, one low carbon, so we can move to low carbon fuels, which has over oil, and also potentially resilience to shocks and disruptions if we get the supply chain and the resources correct. So that's just an overview of how we're sort of, what the challenges are and how we need to address them all. So it's not just about the technology on board the vessels. But let's also look at the timeline. So if we go back to that energy transition, coal to oil, and with all those cases providing the incentives to move forward and not needing the regulatory push, that took over 50 years to get shipping to transfer. In this case, we've got about 25 years, and none of those sort of natural cases are there. So if we take that transition down into an S-curve, so for an energy transition, and this is why we're talking about 5% of fuels by 2030, because we need to instigate this. But what else can we do in this critical window for change? What else can we do now? So there's a lot of talk today and hopefully tomorrow and later as well on energy saving devices and operational savings. So what can we do today even if we're not moving to the fuels? We know tomorrow's fuels are going to cost 2 to 4 times as much, as I've said before. So how are we going to reduce the impact? We're going to move to an era where OPEX is going to be a lot higher than it is today. In fact, the relationship between OPEX and CAPEX is going to be so much more weighted to the OPEX transition that the CAPEX of certain technologies is nearly going to become irrelevant because the fuel cost is going to be so much. So in terms of energy saving devices, what we've got today, how can these be better utilized? In fact, how can they be utilized in the first place as well? So just taking an example in terms of deep sea shipping and wing sails, Flettner rotors, air lubrication technologies, of which UK have many OEMs proactively taking part, why are these not more widely adopted? So we need to start looking at that. You've got EEXI, CII coming out, but part of that as well is the charter arrangement between the ship owner and the ship owner. The actual charter arrangement used today was actually written for the energy transition from wind to coal, and that puts it into perspective of how much further we need to move forward. In terms of, so that's the energy saving devices, we need more wide dot. They still need to mature. The technology is available today, but we need them to mature so that tomorrow we're in a much better place, that we're utilizing it and we've got the maximum efficiency gains from them. The other side is operational profile as well. How can we operationally drive our vessels better? Just-in-time arrival for deep sea shipping, no waiting at the Suez Canal, no waiting at the Panama Canal, and a lot better operational profile. Also behavioral science as well. Are the vessels being driven correctly? Is the captain ordering them, leaving the port in the most efficient way? Is the charterer or the office team also given the instructions to allow that? What was interesting, I don't have a big offshore wind background, but looking at the pictures earlier, you had the bollard push, which we were talking about. You had a vessel going very large power, a lot of emissions coming out the back, but it's not actually moving anywhere. So let's talk about things differently. Do we actually need that bollard push? I know there's a safety aspect there, but is there another way of doing that safety without all those emissions? And then we can avoid damaging the turbine as well. So let's think about things differently. Then we've got the scaling up of fuel, so massive scaling up. Get that 5% started. This is where the Clydebank Declaration fits in with the green corridors. Let's instigate the beginning of that supply demand, and then it needs to grow from there. And then we're really moving into an era of scaling up the zero carbon fuels and full adoption by 2050. Again, it's not just looking at ships themselves. We can't look at individual vessels. We've got to look at the whole supply chain. We can have a zero-emission vessel on the water to run on ammonia, say a cargo ship to run on ammonia by 2024, 2025. So that part of the technology and question is already resolved. And the cost is not going to be so much. It's going to be the resources. So how many wind turbines are coming on? Where's the energy for those wind turbines coming? Where's it coming from today? It's very good to see actually this morning the presentation discussing that, yeah, at the low peaks, they can then create the energy demand for other uses. Where else is shipping competing with, and how's that going to scale up? There's a large part of the technology involved for the production, conversion, and system integration. So here we're talking very much about what's the electrolysis capacity. Very much like battery technology, electrolysis technology is ever increasing to get the price down of the hydrogen. The more we get that price down, the more cost competitive it can become in the future. On that side as well, when we're talking about synthetic fuels, so if we're talking about synthetic liquid methane or even synthetic aviation fuels or anything else, then direct air capture will play a huge part in this. Where are we getting the carbon from which we're going to use? At the moment, direct air capture is one of the costliest elements in terms of synthetic fuels. So when we're talking about a drop-in fuel, if we could migrate to this vessel and it's a drop-in fuel, it's going to be very, very costly. And last but not least is the ports and bunkering integration. And that's really that middle ground. How do we link the two up? When we talk about safety, we talk about the ports scaling up. Ports will be moving on to supply new fuel. Coming back to the safety part on ammonia and hydrogen in particular, when you're storing significant volumes, when I say significant, 50 tons or 500 tons for ammonia, is you then become a coma level 2 site. So you've got a very high level of safety then coming in. So these are all parts which we need to look across the whole fuel supply when we're talking about the decarbonisation of shipping. Putting that into further context as well, that when we look across the whole supply chain there, we also then need to break it down. And I talked about the levers we're working across. But we're talking about, and this is available publicly as well, so don't squint your eyes too much. But we've got the technology readiness. So across the spectrum of fuel solutions, which we've assessed, technology readiness actually is probably the highest out of the three of them across the whole supply chain. The marine solutions are being validated. We've got pilots already going on the water at the moment as well across the industry. Community readiness is really what's policy doing, what's regulation doing, but we're calling it community readiness because we're seeing that commercial drive or the end user drive. So when I talk about the COSEV agreement, the people behind that, that's Amazon, IKEA, Unilever, Patagonia. There's a few large players there involved in significant parts of shipping who will drive that push. So whilst community readiness is low, we do need the appropriate policies. That is coming. And what we will see is that when the policy comes, that will drive the investment and will drive further technology. So the three are interlinked together. But really, when we look at this, we see that the investment readiness level is low at the moment across all the fuels and across the whole supply chain. The fuels are more expensive than the fossil fuels used today. We've got uncertainty in the fuel mix and the competitiveness in the mid to long term. And the commercial proposition hasn't yet been validated. So we're always looking at these things and how they're changing. Now, the purpose behind, we've called this tool, which we've put out, is a zero carbon fuel monitor. And the reason we produced this was for our own internal, one, to see where the industry sits, but also then to use this to drive our own projects forward. So where we see a low technology readiness or a low investment readiness, we'll then divert a project into that. We'll go and get project partners and see if we can raise that ambition part. So what we've done with the investment readiness is basically we've pulled it apart and we've seen how we can increase the investment readiness moving up. And we have to pull in various parties to that project. So we looked at a particular fleet of first movers. And in this case, we took a case study between Hong Kong and Singapore. And we took the container ship. So really, we're talking feeder container ship size. And then we looked at the fuel demand from that fleet of container ships. And then from that fuel demand, we've then looked at the fuel supply demand as well. Because we looked at levelized cost of production, but levelized cost of production is not just about one fuel. Levelized cost of production will change country to country. So some countries can produce renewable energy a lot cheaper than others, particularly those with large amounts of solar and large amounts of wind. But the cost of production for energy consumption for solar is going to be a lot more competitive than wind. So places like Morocco, Chile, South Africa suddenly become very dominant in a potential energy market. What's the cost of that energy going to be? How much is it going to cost to transport it as well? So we've looked at that, and that paper is now public and moving forward. So what we've done from that is we've created a framework. And this framework is really there to break the chicken and egg scenario. So when we talk to fuel suppliers, they're saying, well, we can't build a fuel supply system because we don't know what the demand is. We've got no offtake agreement. When we talk to ship owners, the answer is, well, yeah, we would produce a ship to run on ammonia or hydrogen and methanol, but the fuel isn't available, so it'll be a wasted asset for the first few years of life. So the framework is really to pull the two together and to look at fleets, so not specific vessels in certain operational areas, but to look at fleets in areas. Now, whether that's one type of ship segment or actually whether it's a fleet in a geographical area. And therefore, how do you take that in? How do you estimate that fuel demand? And how do you marry it up to the fuel supply? And this is the way we're now working in terms of collaboration. And how do we work across the industry to move it forwards? So really, on that side, it is how we've broken the chicken and egg, how we're making a fleet, how we're linking the fleet transition into an energy transition. And in order for this to move forward, this isn't just about green corridors. We've been working backwards from 2050. We'll hit the green corridor target in this Singapore-Hong Kong route. But the key, and so we'll hit the green corridor target, but the key is to have that long-term business plan. So when we're coming back to that energy, the energy transition curve, which I showed earlier, it's a lot more about not just what can I do today, but it's about preparing for the future. We can't all take action today because the fuel's not going to be available 2025, 2030, but we do need a fleet transition strategy in all areas starting to build up. So it's about collaboration. It's about collaboration between the ship owners to give the signal demand of the fuel they're going to use. And that's for the fuel suppliers to deliver the demand. And it's also about the ports to supply that demand which will be given. And it's not just about collaboration within the maritime industry as well. I think at this early stage we need to look at other industries. As was pointed out, the shipping industry does nothing. It's not just its percentage share isn't going to stay at 2.8% of today. It's going to rise increasingly over time. But other sectors are going through the same challenge. When I showed the fuel, the supply chain, and we had resources, production, and ports, I've done a similar presentation with Airbus, and they had exactly the same slide, but with the airplane and not the ship at the end. So there's other learnings we can take from other industries. So it's about collaboration. It's about collaboration within the maritime industry and across all the sectors, but it's also about looking at other industries and what they're doing and how it can move forwards. Okay, thank you.